In the summer of 2009, a warehouse forklift operator in Oakland, California, executed what federal investigators would later describe as one of the most audacious inventory thefts in American retail history. Over the course of 7 months, Jerome Patterson walked out of the Pacific Distribution Center with $3.1 million in consumer electronics. The scheme was so simple, so perfectly calibrated to the rhythms of modern logistics, that it went completely undetected until a routine quarterly audit revealed a shortage so massive it triggered immediate FBI involvement. What made this case extraordinary was not the complexity of the crime, but its stunning simplicity. Patterson never disabled a single security measure. He never falsified a computer record. He never wore a disguise or worked in darkness. Instead, he exploited the one vulnerability that no security system had been designed to catch: the assumption that anyone moving high-value merchandise so openly, so confidently, must have legitimate authorization to do so. For 7 months, Patterson drove his forklift through the same aisles, past the same colleagues, under the same security protocols that were supposed to protect millions of dollars in inventory. And for 7 months, no one suspected a thing. The electronics he stole were never hidden. They were stacked on pallets in full view, shrink-wrapped in their original packaging, rolled past every checkpoint in the building. The theft happened in plain sight, captured on dozens of hours of security footage that showed nothing more suspicious than a man doing his job. The case would eventually expose critical flaws in inventory management systems used by major retailers across the country and force a complete reimagining of how warehouses track high-value merchandise. But in the spring of 2009, as Jerome Patterson clocked in for another graveyard shift, none of that mattered. He had discovered something remarkable in a warehouse moving millions of dollars in electronics every week. The most effective disguise was not invisibility, but normalcy itself. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The perfect storm. The Pacific Distribution Center occupied nearly 400,000 square feet in the industrial flatlands of West Oakland, wedged between Interstate 880 and the sprawling container terminals that fed the Bay Area's insatiable appetite for consumer goods. Built in the late 90s during the dot-com boom, the facility served as a critical node in the supply chain for a major electronics retailer, handling everything from flat-screen televisions to gaming consoles to laptop computers. At its peak operational capacity, the warehouse processed upward of 15,000 individual items per day. Jerome Patterson had worked at the Pacific Distribution Center since 2003. He was 41 years old when he started, a Navy veteran who had served 6 years as a logistics specialist before receiving an honorable discharge. His military background made him an ideal candidate for warehouse work. He understood inventory systems, respected chain of command, and possessed the kind of methodical attention to detail that kept complex operations running smoothly. His references were impeccable. His employment history showed remarkable stability. He passed his background check without issue. For the first 5 years of his employment, Patterson was exactly what management wanted: reliable, punctual, and unremarkable. He worked the graveyard shift, 11 at night until 7 in the morning, operating a Catawba Series 5000 forklift through the warehouse's maze of aisles. The shift differential added an extra $2.50 to his hourly wage, bringing his total compensation to just under $42,000 a year before taxes. It was enough to cover rent on his studio apartment in East Oakland, enough to make payments on his aging Honda Civic, enough to keep the lights on and food in the refrigerator. It was not enough to build savings or plan for retirement or imagine a future substantially different from his present. By early 2008, Patterson's financial situation had deteriorated significantly. His mother, who lived in Richmond, had been diagnosed with late-stage diabetes and required regular dialysis treatments that her Medicare coverage only partially covered. Patterson had begun sending her $500 a month to help with medical expenses, a sum that represented nearly a quarter of his take-home pay. He had maxed out 2 credit cards covering emergency dental work. His car needed a new transmission that would cost $1,800 he did not have. He had applied for overtime shifts, but the warehouse had reduced staffing in response to the beginning tremors of what would become the Great Recession. Patterson was not a criminal by nature or inclination. He had no arrest record, no history of theft, no connection to organized crime, but he was desperate, and desperation has a way of reshaping perception. What had once seemed impossible began to seem merely difficult. What had once seemed unconscionable began to seem rational, even necessary. The idea came to him gradually over the course of several months. It was not a sudden revelation, but a slow accumulation of observations, each one adding to a growing awareness of systemic vulnerabilities that most employees never noticed because they had no reason to look. The Pacific Distribution Center operated on what is known in logistics as a just-in-time inventory model. Merchandise arrived from overseas manufacturers and domestic suppliers, was briefly staged in the warehouse, and then shipped out to retail locations across Northern California and Nevada. The emphasis was on speed and throughput. Items spent an average of 72 hours in the facility before moving on to their next destination. This constant flow created enormous efficiency, but also made accurate inventory tracking remarkably difficult. Physical inventory counts happened quarterly, a massive undertaking that required bringing in temporary workers and suspending normal operations for 3 full days. Between these quarterly counts, the warehouse relied on a computerized inventory management system that tracked items as they moved through various stages, receiving, staging, picking, and shipping. The system was sophisticated in theory, but in practice it depended on human beings scanning barcodes accurately at each transition point. Mistakes were common. Items were frequently marked as shipped when they were still in the warehouse, or marked as received when they had not yet arrived. The system had a built-in error tolerance of approximately 2%, meaning that discrepancies of up to $50,000 per quarter were considered normal shrinkage and written off without investigation. Patterson began to study the warehouse with the same methodical attention he had once applied to Navy supply chains. He noticed that certain aisles, particularly those in the northwest quadrant of the building, received significantly less foot traffic than others. He observed that the graveyard shift operated with a skeleton crew, 2 supervisors for the entire facility, both of whom spent most of their time in the main office dealing with paperwork and scheduling issues. He noted that forklifts moved constantly throughout the night, repositioning pallets, consolidating shipments, staging merchandise for the morning shift. The sound of electric motors and the beeping of reversing vehicles created a constant ambient noise that made individual movements unremarkable. Most importantly, Patterson realized that the loading docks on the building's east side, which handled outbound shipments to retail stores, were almost entirely automated during night shifts. Pallets were staged in designated zones, and truck drivers arriving for early morning pickups were authorized to load their own vehicles as long as the items matched their manifest. Supervisors rarely came down to the docks during these hours unless a driver reported a problem. The process relied on trust and efficiency rather than direct oversight. Patterson spent 3 months simply watching and learning before he made any move. He began volunteering for extra assignments that took him to different parts of the warehouse, familiarizing himself with layouts and protocols he would not normally encounter. He memorized the schedules of security guards and supervisors, learning who was likely to be where at any given time. He studied the inventory management software, understanding not just how it worked, but how its limitations created opportunities for manipulation. By December 2008, Patterson had developed a plan that was remarkable for its simplicity. He would not hack computer systems or forge documents or recruit accomplices. He would not disable security measures or work in darkness or attempt to conceal his actions. Instead, he would exploit the fundamental assumption underlying warehouse security, that anyone moving merchandise openly and confidently must be authorized to do so. In a facility where thousands of items moved every day, where forklifts operated constantly, where the emphasis was on speed and efficiency rather than verification. A single operator moving electronics to unauthorized locations would be functionally invisible as long as his actions appeared routine. The genius of Patterson's scheme was that it required no special skills or resources beyond those he already possessed. He had legitimate access to every part of the facility. He had a valid security badge and authorized forklift certification. He knew the locations of high-value electronics and understood the warehouse's traffic patterns. Most crucially, he understood that in modern logistics, trust is more efficient than verification, and that this efficiency creates blind spots where patient criminals can operate with impunity. The first move, Patterson chose his moment carefully. It was a Tuesday night in late January 2009, cold and clear, with light traffic on the freeways and minimal activity in the warehouse. The quarterly inventory count had concluded 3 weeks earlier, meaning he had roughly 10 weeks before the next comprehensive audit would reveal any discrepancies. The timing was crucial. He needed enough of a buffer to establish his operation before anyone started asking questions. At 1:15 in the morning, Patterson positioned his forklift in aisle 47, deep in the consumer electronics section, where the highest value items were stored. The aisle contained approximately 60 pallets of flat-screen televisions, each pallet holding 12 42-inch displays, with a retail value of approximately $800 per unit. The total value of merchandise in that single aisle exceeded $500,000. Patterson selected a pallet containing Samsung televisions and carefully lifted it onto his forks. The movement was identical to hundreds of other moves he made during a typical shift. Nothing about his posture or speed or positioning suggested anything unusual. He drove the forklift at a steady pace through the main corridors, past the break room where 2 co-workers sat drinking coffee, toward the east loading dock. The critical moment came when Patterson deviated from standard procedure. Instead of staging the pallet in one of the designated outbound zones where it would be matched against shipping manifests, he moved it to Dock 7, a bay that was technically operational but rarely used during night shifts because it lacked direct access to the main staging area. The dock was not monitored any differently than the others, but its location at the far end of the building meant that supervisors making rounds would be less likely to notice activity there. Patterson set the pallet down in the shadows near the dock door, then returned his forklift to its normal position and continued with his regular duties. For the next 3 hours, he worked exactly as he would on any other night, moving pallets, organizing inventory, completing the tasks listed on his assignment sheet. At 4:30, he took his scheduled break. The test would come the next morning. If anyone had noticed the misplaced pallet, if anyone had questioned why electronics were staged at an unused dock, if the inventory system had flagged the discrepancy, Patterson's plan would end before it truly began. He drove home that morning with his heart pounding, half expecting to find police waiting at his apartment. Nothing happened. The pallet sat at Dock 7 throughout the day shift, unremarked and unquestioned. To anyone who noticed it at all, it appeared to be merchandise awaiting shipment, perhaps set aside for a special delivery or held for a customer pickup. In the constant flow of warehouse operations, a single misplaced pallet was too minor an irregularity to warrant investigation. Patterson returned that night and moved the pallet again, this time to a location even further removed from normal operations, a storage area near the building's maintenance bay, where old equipment and damaged merchandise were temporarily held before being returned to suppliers or written off. The electronics were now completely off the grid, existing in a kind of liminal space where the inventory system showed them as still in active stock, but their physical location was known only to Patterson. He let them sit for a week, monitoring for any indication that someone was looking for the merchandise. None came. The quarterly audit was still 9 weeks away. The inventory management system showed the televisions as present somewhere in the warehouse, which was sufficient for daily operations. No retail stores had specifically ordered those units, so there was no downstream pressure to locate them. They had effectively vanished into the background noise of a facility processing thousands of items daily. Patterson's second move was bolder. He enlisted his older brother, Deshaun Patterson, who owned a small, used furniture store in Richmond. Deshawn operated on the margins of the legitimate economy, buying and selling merchandise that fell off trucks or came from estate sales or emerged from storage unit auctions. He asked few questions and kept no detailed records. When Jerome approached him about moving some electronics, Deshawn understood immediately that his brother was involved in something illegal, but blood loyalty and the promise of profit overcame whatever scruples he might have had. On a Sunday afternoon in mid-February, Deshawn backed his 16-foot rental truck up to the maintenance bay door. The facility was minimally staffed on weekends, with only a handful of employees handling emergency orders. Jerome, who had volunteered for a weekend shift, used his badge to open the bay door from inside. The transfer took less than 10 minutes. 12 42-inch televisions, still in their original packaging, were loaded into Deshawn's truck. The brothers did not speak during the operation. There was nothing to say. Deshawn sold the televisions within 3 days, moving them through a network of small electronic stores and independent sellers who operated in the grey market between legitimate retail and outright fencing. Each television sold for $400, roughly half its retail value, but sufficient to generate a profit of $4,800 minus Deshawn's cut. Jerome received $30 to $200 in cash, more money than he had seen at one time since leaving the Navy. The simplicity of the operation was intoxicating. Patterson had spent months planning and worrying, imagining all the ways he might be caught, and yet the actual execution had been almost effortless. The warehouse security system was designed to prevent external theft, not internal diversion. As long as merchandise remained within the facility, as long as it did not trigger exit alarms or generate manifest discrepancies, it could be moved with impunity. And once it was staged in an unused location, extracting it was merely a matter of timing and opportunity, scaling the operation over. The next 5 months, Jerome Patterson refined his method into a sophisticated system of theft that operated at a scale that should have been impossible to conceal. What had begun as a desperate attempt to cover medical bills evolved into something far more ambitious, a systematic looting of high-value inventory that would eventually total more than $3 million. The key to Patterson's success was patience and discipline. He never stole impulsively. He never took more than he could safely move in a single operation. He never deviated from his established patterns of behavior that might alert supervisors or co-workers. Instead, he approached the theft with the same meticulous planning that had characterized his military logistics work, treating each operation as a carefully choreographed exercise in risk management. Patterson developed a detailed system for selecting merchandise. He focused exclusively on consumer electronics with high resale value and strong secondary market demand. Flat-screen televisions, laptop computers, gaming consoles, high-end audio equipment, and digital cameras. He avoided appliances, furniture, and other bulky items that would be difficult to move and harder to sell. He paid attention to seasonal patterns, knowing that certain items moved faster through the warehouse during specific times of year, and that their absence would be less likely to trigger immediate investigation. He also learned to exploit the inventory management system's quirks and limitations. The warehouse used a zone-based tracking method, meaning that items were recorded as being in specific areas rather than at precise locations. When merchandise moved from one zone to another, employees were supposed to scan it, but in the chaos of night operations, scanning was inconsistent at best. Patterson began deliberately moving items between zones multiple times, creating a confusing trail in the computer system that showed electronics bouncing around the facility without clear destination. By the time the quarterly audit arrived, these items would appear to have been misplaced or miscounted rather than stolen. His extraction method also evolved. Rather than waiting for weekends when his brother could access the maintenance bay, Patterson identified a loading dock on the facility's north side that was used primarily for receiving shipments during day shifts, but sat largely idle at night. The dock had a large apron area where trucks could park while waiting for access to the bays. Patterson began staging pallets near this dock, positioning them just inside the building but close enough to the exit that they could be quickly loaded when opportunity arose. Deshaun Patterson's role expanded from simple transportation to becoming the crucial link in a distribution network that moved stolen electronics into legitimate commerce. He recruited 2 associates who operated small electronics stores in Oakland and Hayward, both men who understood that they were buying stolen goods but maintained plausible deniability by never asking direct questions about sourcing. The goods moved quickly. A pallet of laptops that Jerome diverted on Tuesday would be in retail stores by Friday, their serial numbers never recorded, their provenance never questioned. The profits were substantial. Patterson's share averaged between $8,000 and $12,000 per month, more than triple his legitimate warehouse salary. He used the money carefully, avoiding the kind of conspicuous consumption that might draw attention. He paid off his credit cards and brought his car payments current. He increased the monthly support he sent to his mother, allowing her to afford better medical care. He began putting money into a savings account at a credit union in Berkeley, making deposits small enough to avoid triggering federal reporting requirements. By May 2009, Patterson had stolen more than 600 individual items worth approximately $1.2 million at retail value. The operation had become almost routine. He knew which nights offered the best opportunities based on staffing patterns and delivery schedules. He knew exactly how long he could leave merchandise staged in unauthorized locations before it might attract attention. He knew how to select items that would generate maximum profit with minimum risk. On a Thursday night in early June, Patterson executed his most ambitious operation yet. A shipment of high-end Apple laptops had arrived earlier that day, 48 units with a retail value of $1,800 each. The laptops were stored in a secure cage in the electronics zone, but Patterson had legitimate access as part of his duties. At 2:30 in the morning, he used his supervisor's master key, which he had borrowed and copied months earlier, to enter the cage. He removed 2 pallets containing a total of 24 laptops and moved them to his staging area near the North Dock. The following Sunday, Deshaun made 3 separate trips with his rental truck, each time loading 8 laptops into carefully packed boxes that looked like legitimate merchandise returns. The operation netted Jerome nearly $20,000, his largest single take. The laptops vanished into the secondary market so quickly that their serial numbers were never entered into any theft database. For all practical purposes, they had never existed. Patterson began to feel invincible. 7 months into his operation, he had stolen more than $2 million in merchandise without a single close call or moment of suspicion. The warehouse continued to function exactly as it always had. His co-workers treated him no differently. His supervisors praised his reliability and work ethic. The inventory system showed normal levels of shrinkage within acceptable parameters. He had discovered a vulnerability so fundamental, so deeply embedded in the structure of modern logistics, that it seemed impossible to defend against. But his success contained the seeds of its own undoing. The sheer scale of the theft was approaching a threshold where it could no longer be hidden by the background noise of normal inventory discrepancies. And someone, somewhere in the Pacific Distribution Center's accounting department, was beginning to notice that something was wrong. The unraveling, the first indication of trouble, came not from security or warehouse management, but from the corporate accounting office in San Jose. In early August 2009, a financial analyst named Patricia Moreno was reviewing quarterly shrinkage reports across all of the company's West Coast distribution centers when she noticed an anomaly. The Pacific Distribution Center's shrinkage rate for the second quarter had spiked to nearly 4%, double the company average and well above the 2% threshold that was considered normal operating variance. 4% shrinkage in a facility processing $80 million in merchandise per quarter translated to approximately $3.2 million in unaccounted inventory. The number was so large that Moreno initially assumed it was a data entry error. She contacted the warehouse's inventory manager, a man named Donald Chen, and asked him to verify the figures. Chen ran the numbers again and confirmed that Moreno's analysis was correct. The discrepancy was real. Somewhere in the Pacific Distribution Center's sprawling aisles, merchandise worth millions of dollars had vanished. The initial investigation focused on paperwork errors and system glitches, A team of auditors descended on the facility, pulling records, checking manifests, interviewing shipping clerks. They discovered numerous small discrepancies. Items marked as shipped that were never loaded. Merchandise marked as received that never arrived. Pallets that had been moved multiple times without proper documentation. But none of these errors, either individually or in aggregate, could account for the massive shortfall. Chen authorized a complete physical inventory count, the second such audit in less than 6 months. The warehouse suspended normal operations for a full week, while teams of workers methodically scanned every item in the facility. The count confirmed what the financial analysis had suggested. The warehouse was short approximately $3 million in high-value electronics. The missing items were not concentrated in any single area, but distributed across dozens of product categories. Flat-screen televisions, laptops, gaming consoles, cameras all showed significant shortfalls. The pattern suggested systematic theft rather than random shrinkage, and Chen immediately contacted the FBI's Oakland field office. Within 48 hours, 2 special agents specializing in cargo theft arrived at the Pacific Distribution Center to begin a federal investigation. Agent Sarah Kemp and Agent Michael Torres had worked together for 6 years investigating theft from warehouses, shipping facilities, and cargo terminals throughout Northern California. They understood immediately that they were dealing with an inside job. The scale and sophistication of the operation ruled out opportunistic theft by warehouse workers supplementing their income with occasional stolen items. This was systematic looting, executed by someone with detailed knowledge of warehouse operations and security protocols. The agents began by reviewing security footage from the previous 6 months. The Pacific Distribution Center maintained a comprehensive surveillance system, with cameras covering all loading docks, main aisles, and entry points. The system recorded continuously, storing footage on digital servers for 90 days before overwriting. Kemp and Torres spent days watching footage, looking for anything suspicious: unauthorized access, unusual movement patterns, after-hours activity that deviated from normal procedures. What they found was both frustrating and revealing. The footage showed exactly what one would expect to see in a functioning warehouse: forklifts moving pallets, workers completing tasks, supervisors making rounds. There were no obvious indications of theft, no moments where someone clearly loaded merchandise into unauthorized vehicles or removed items from the facility in suspicious circumstances. But Kemp noticed something curious. In dozens of segments of footage from night shifts over recent months, the same forklift operator appeared, moving electronics through areas of the warehouse that seemed slightly outside the normal traffic patterns. The operator was Jerome Patterson. The agents pulled Patterson's employment records and personnel file. On paper, he looked like an exemplary employee. 6 years of steady service, good performance reviews, no disciplinary actions, no indication of financial problems or criminal connections. But when Kemp and Torres began interviewing Patterson's co-workers and supervisors, a different picture emerged. Several night shift employees mentioned that Patterson often volunteered for assignments in the electronics section, even though zone rotation meant he should have been working in different areas. A supervisor recalled that Patterson had once requested and received a copy of the warehouse layout, claiming he wanted to improve his efficiency. Another employee mentioned seeing Patterson near the maintenance bay on a Sunday afternoon, unusual because Patterson normally only worked weekdays. The agents obtained financial records through a federal subpoena. Patterson's bank accounts showed regular cash deposits over the previous 7 months, totaling more than $60,000, far more than his warehouse salary could explain. The deposits were carefully structured to stay below the $10,000 threshold that would trigger automatic federal reporting, a technique known as structuring that was itself a federal crime. On August 23rd, Kemp and Torres brought Patterson in for questioning. They did not arrest him or read him his rights. Instead, they invited him to the FBI field office to help with their investigation, suggesting that his knowledge of warehouse operations might prove valuable. Patterson agreed, perhaps believing he could still talk his way out of suspicion. The interview lasted 3 hours. The agents began gently asking general questions about warehouse procedures and security protocols. Patterson was cooperative and articulate, clearly comfortable discussing logistics and inventory management. But as the questions became more specific, his confidence began to erode. When Kemp asked him to explain the cash deposits, Patterson claimed he had been doing side work repairing cars. When Torres asked why he was frequently seen in unauthorized areas during night shifts, Patterson said he was simply trying to be helpful. When they showed him security footage of him moving electronics to the North Dock, Patterson insisted he was following supervisor instructions. The agents did not challenge his explanations directly. Instead, they thanked him for his time and let him go. But Patterson understood what was happening. The investigation was closing in. His months of careful planning and disciplined execution were unraveling because of something he had never fully considered: the cumulative weight of evidence that would become visible once anyone started looking at the whole picture rather than individual incidents. That night, Patterson did not go to work. He called in sick for the first time in his 6-year employment history. He spent the next 36 hours in his apartment, considering his options. He could run, but where would he go with $60,000 and no support network outside California? He could stay and fight, but the evidence was overwhelming. He could destroy the cash, but that would not erase the bank records or explain the missing inventory. On August 25th, Jerome Patterson hired a criminal defense attorney and began negotiating a plea agreement. He confessed to the theft, explaining his methods in detail and providing information about his brother's role in selling the stolen merchandise. In exchange for his cooperation, federal prosecutors agreed to recommend a reduced sentence and to charge him with theft from an interstate shipment rather than organized crime or racketeering, charges that would have carried significantly longer prison terms. Deshaun Patterson was arrested 3 days later at his furniture store in Richmond. He initially denied any involvement, but when confronted with his brother's confession and phone records showing dozens of calls between them during the relevant time period, he accepted a plea agreement that would send him to federal prison for 18 months. On November 12, 2009, Jerome Patterson pleaded guilty in United States District Court for the Northern District of California to theft of goods from an interstate shipment, a federal felony. At his sentencing hearing in January 2010, his attorney painted a sympathetic picture of a desperate man driven to crime by medical expenses and economic hardship. The prosecutor countered with evidence of sophisticated planning and systematic theft that went far beyond a momentary lapse in judgment. Judge Marilyn Hall Patel sentenced Patterson to 6 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. In her remarks from the bench, Judge Patel acknowledged Patterson's difficult circumstances, but emphasized that his actions had betrayed the trust of his employer and exploited vulnerabilities in systems that millions of people depended on for honest commerce. She noted that while Patterson's methods were unsophisticated compared to complex financial crimes, the brazenness of his theft and the length of time it continued reflected a calculated disregard for the law. Patterson served 4 years of his sentence at the Federal Correctional Institution in Lompoc before being released on parole in January 2014. He returned to the Bay Area, but struggled to find stable employment with a federal felony conviction. As of 2016, he was working as a warehouse associate at a small industrial supply company in Fremont, earning minimum wage under close supervision. Lessons learned. The Patterson case sent shockwaves through the logistics and retail industries. A single warehouse worker with no technical skills and no accomplices inside the facility had stolen more than $3 million over 7 months, and the theft had only been discovered through routine financial analysis rather than security measures. The implications were staggering. The Pacific Distribution Center implemented sweeping changes to its operations. The facility installed real-time inventory tracking using RFID technology that could pinpoint the location of high-value items within seconds. Quarterly audits were replaced with continuous cycle counting that verified inventory on a rolling basis. Loading dock procedures were completely restructured to require supervisor approval for any merchandise movement. Access to secure storage cages was restricted and logged electronically. Most significantly, the facility ended its practice of tolerating 2% shrinkage as normal, instead treating any inventory discrepancy as a potential security breach requiring immediate investigation. These changes became industry standards. Within 18 months, every major retailer in the country had reviewed and upgraded their warehouse security protocols. The cost of implementing these changes ran into hundreds of millions of dollars across the industry. But the alternative, continuing to operate facilities with the kind of blind spots Patterson had exploited, was unacceptable. The case also highlighted the human element in logistics security. Patterson's success depended not on technical sophistication, but on understanding human nature and organizational psychology. He knew that people in warehouses were focused on efficiency and throughput rather than verification. He understood that workers making routine movements would not be questioned as long as those movements appeared normal. He exploited the fact that trust is more efficient than constant verification, and that modern supply chains depend on that efficiency to function. The $3 million in stolen electronics were never recovered. The merchandise had moved through secondary markets so quickly that tracking it proved impossible. Insurance covered most of the loss, but the reputational damage to the Pacific Distribution Center and its parent company was substantial. Several executives lost their jobs. Shareholder lawsuits alleged negligence in protecting company assets. The warehouse itself was eventually closed in 2012 as the company restructured its West Coast distribution network, though officials insisted the closure was unrelated to the Patterson theft. For law enforcement, the case served as a reminder that cargo theft remains one of the FBI's priority crime categories, costing American businesses an estimated $30 billion annually. The vast majority of these thefts involve some form of insider knowledge or participation. Patterson was unusual only in the duration and scale of his operation, not in his methods or motivations. The human cost of the crime extended beyond Patterson and his brother. The warehouse workers who had trained Patterson trusted him, worked alongside him for years, felt betrayed. Some questioned whether they had missed warning signs. Others wondered whether their own actions might have inadvertently enabled the theft. The culture of the workplace was permanently altered, with suspicion and verification replacing trust and efficiency. Jerome Patterson's case ultimately stands as a cautionary tale about the vulnerabilities inherent in modern logistics systems. In an economy built on speed and efficiency, where merchandise moves constantly and tracking depends on human compliance with protocols, the potential for internal theft is enormous. Patterson proved that sophisticated technology and comprehensive security measures are meaningless if they are not coupled with systems that can detect patterns of behavior that appear normal but serve criminal purposes. The question that haunted investigators long after the case closed was simple and disturbing. How many other Jerome Pattersons are out there, exploiting the same vulnerabilities, operating in the same blind spots, stealing millions of dollars from warehouses and distribution centers across the country? And if it took 7 months and a $3 million loss to catch this one, how long might others continue operating before anyone notices? Those questions remain unanswered, but the Patterson case ensures they continue to be asked. In warehouses and distribution centers across America, managers now look at their most reliable employees with a new sense of wariness, understanding that trust and criminality can coexist in the same person, and that the best disguise is often the appearance of doing nothing wrong at all. In the years following his conviction, Jerome Patterson became the subject of multiple case studies by forensic psychologists and criminologists, attempting to understand how an otherwise law-abiding individual could execute such a prolonged criminal enterprise. Dr. Rebecca Choi, a professor of criminal psychology at UC Berkeley, interviewed Patterson extensively during his incarceration at Lompoc and published her findings in the Journal of Criminal Behavior in 2012. What emerged from these interviews was a complex portrait of rationalization and moral disengagement. Patterson did not see himself as a thief in the conventional sense. In his own mind, he was engaged in a form of wealth redistribution, taking from a corporation that would barely notice the loss and using the proceeds to support his ailing mother and stabilize his own precarious financial situation. He repeatedly emphasized during interviews that he never stole from individuals, never put anyone in physical danger, and never caused harm that could not be absorbed by insurance and corporate profit margins. This cognitive framework allowed Patterson to maintain his self-image as a fundamentally good person, even while committing felonies. He continued to see himself as the reliable employee his supervisors praised, the devoted son who supported his mother, the Navy veteran who had served his country honorably. The theft existed in a separate mental compartment, a necessary but temporary deviation from his normal moral code that circumstances had forced upon him. Dr. Choi noted that this type of rationalization is extremely common among white-collar criminals and insider thieves. Unlike violent criminals or career criminals who often embrace deviant identities, insider thieves typically maintain conventional social identities and moral self-concepts. They are able to commit crimes precisely because they do not see themselves as criminals. This psychological splitting allows them to violate laws and betray trust while experiencing minimal guilt or cognitive dissonance. Patterson's military background played a crucial role in his criminal success. The same skills that made him an effective logistics specialist, attention to detail, patience, systematic planning, ability to follow complex procedures, proved equally valuable in executing his theft operation. He approached the crime with the disciplined methodology of a military operation, conducting reconnaissance, identifying objectives, planning contingencies, and executing with precision. In some ways, his months of theft represented the most sophisticated application of his professional skills he had ever undertaken. The financial pressures that initially motivated Patterson were real and significant. But investigators later discovered that his circumstances were not as desperate as he claimed. His mother's medical expenses, while substantial, were being partially covered by a combination of Medicare, Medicaid, and a supplemental insurance policy she had maintained from her years working as a public school teacher. Patterson's car repairs could have been financed through the credit union where he banked. His credit card debt, while burdensome, was not insurmountable. What Patterson lacked was not options but patience and willingness to accept the slow, grinding process of financial recovery that millions of working-class Americans navigate without turning to crime. The warehouse theft offered something psychologically irresistible, a shortcut, a way to solve problems immediately, rather than enduring years of sacrifice and incremental progress. Once he had proven to himself that the theft was possible, once he had experienced the intoxicating rush of easy money, returning to legitimate struggle became psychologically impossible. The ripple effects, the impact of Patterson's crime, extended far beyond the immediate financial loss to his employer. The case triggered a comprehensive review of warehouse security practices across the retail industry, leading to technological and procedural changes that cost billions of dollars to implement, but ultimately proved necessary to address systemic vulnerabilities. The insurance company that covered the Pacific Distribution Center's loss hired a team of consultants to conduct a forensic analysis of the theft. Their report, portions of which were later leaked to industry publications, was scathing in its assessment of the facility's security culture. The consultants found that management had prioritized operational efficiency over security to such an extent that basic safeguards had been rendered meaningless. The security cameras that recorded Patterson's movements had never been systematically reviewed, except in response to specific incidents. The inventory management system that tracked merchandise movement was riddled with known bugs and inconsistencies that employees had learned to work around rather than fixing. The access controls that should have restricted movement of high-value items existed on paper, but were routinely bypassed in practice to avoid slowing down operations.